How could you think Remake was bad? How could you think it was great? Many of us seem incapable of saying, I understand why you would feel the way you do, but I don't agree. And it's the absence of being able to empathise with the why that is the problem. You know, fans who disliked Remake, fans like me, people like to say we're the whispers, the plot ghosts, sticklers for keeping the narrative as rigidly close to the original game as possible. But I think we're more like the weapons, buried in the planet's core, defenders of the essence of FF7, hell-bent on destroying bad writing, what we see as a virus, threatening the themes and sanctity of FF7. We could look the other way, but we've been summoned from the depths of the planet and will be here until the end of... In April 2020, I started this channel to talk about Final Fantasy, a series I've loved for more than 20 years. I figured I'd be making videos about my journey through Remake, but it just so happened that the game's story turned out to be a bit of a disappointment for me. After processing what I just played, I turned to social media to throw my 2 cents into the fountain. My comments were tame at worst. I expected a discussion, but instead received only insults. And that's not to say that level of vitriol was not happening on both sides of the divide, but I'm just telling you the world as I experienced it. After a round of heated comments and messages on social media following my Remake rant, I made a video called Toxic Fans, which was a tongue-in-cheek look at the level of aggression I'd received, simply for expressing an opinion. A slightly provocative video perhaps, where I lampooned some of the more irate fans I had encountered, and some pointed out that I was only adding to the toxicity in the community. But after witnessing my recent and rather innocuous FF7 Remake critique video swarmed by insults, many of which YouTube caught in its net of justice, and my tiny channel become the target of a coordinated campaign to try shut me down purely for my thoughts on Zack and Aerith, I don't think my Toxic Fans video was so off base. There's something very strange going on in the community. Aggressive rage artists, whose seemingly sole desire in the FF7 universe is to see their dream romantic pairings and preferred character resolutions come to fruition. They're taking trial mentalities to new and dizzying heights, perpetuating and maintaining the stark division in the community. It's the type of silencing campaign we've become accustomed to on the internet. People try hammer you to make your opinion seem radical and even rare, as if they hope a dislike ratio will help dissuade anyone new from experiencing your take. They're always the most loud and vocal because they're usually the ones angry enough to comment or interact. Ultimately, they hope you'll go away and take your opinion with you. I guess because it hurts them, deep down, to confront criticism of something they're so passionate about or that forms part of their identity. But over in Team Remake was disappointing. We know there's anger too, people who use insults to shout down other people's enjoyment, and I suspect a lot of that anger has risen out of a feeling of being ignored or ushered away by Remake fans, locking people into a deadly cycle of sorts. But ultimately, this is a video to try unite. It's not aimed at the toxic fans, it's aimed at you, a perfectly logical and reasonable person who is willing to entertain a difference of opinion. Because if there are any toxic fans watching at the start of this video, they've already left by now, I'm sure. If you're here as a Remake fan, I am not your enemy. Fans like me are not your enemy. We only want to express ourselves. I'm happy for you if you enjoyed Remake, and I can understand why you like it. This video may help you understand why we feel the way we do. To that end, I'm going to discuss the common arguments Remake fans table to try and validate our opinions. If you know the arguments, if you understand them, and the answers provided, maybe that will go some way to elevating the conversation and bringing us to a more harmonious place. It's not a remaster, it's a remake. The entire "what is the definition of a remake anyway" argument ain't worth the pixels on our screens. Regardless of dictionary definitions and interpretations, it's incredibly disingenuous and dishonest of Remake fans to report that they expected changes of this scale when they first saw the word remake appear at that E3 conference back in 2015. But fans act like the level of changes we received in the finished product should have been obvious. That Square Enix's comments of "we'll be making some changes" should have been enough for original game fans to get the message that things are about to go a bit crazy. It's a strange hill to die on. You're essentially telling us that even though we're unhappy, we should have expected to be unhappy. So it's our fault, really. And that somehow makes everything okay and invalidates our criticisms. Talk of a Final Fantasy VII Remake goes all the way back to the turn of the millennium, where there were rumours of releasing a 7 Remake on the PS2. Obviously that was never realised, but the demand for a graphical upgrade carried on through the next 2 decades. When people asked for a remake, they were asking for the original game's story. And look, we're not expecting everything to be the exact same, every scene to play out with the exact same dialogue. We're not precious over things happening to the exact same minute detail, but the broad strokes should be the same. Why? Because story matters. Change is perfectly fine when it improves on something, and there were many elements I enjoyed in Remake, moments that elevated the original source material to new heights. But when you start to upend the themes and structure of the story, you're in dangerous territory. I've said it before, but if you had polled all the FF7 fans years back, if Square Enix had asked, do we upgrade the original game with some quality of life improvements, or do we change the story to introduce alternate timeline elements and make it an apparent sequel to the original game, while letting compilation material impact the flow of the story? I feel very strongly that fans would have chose as near a faithful remake as they could get. Obviously if Square Enix had said they intend to bring Zack back, or even have the chance to save Aerith, you're going to have some fans in favour of taking the story in a new direction, in order to save their favourite character. But ultimately, I think the results would have been very decisive for getting a faithful remake. Why? Because Final Fantasy VII is a video game that is famous for its story. Why, oh why, would you change it? In Resident Evil 2's remake, there are some scenario changes, but the game remains fully recognisable to fans of the original game. It doesn't matter that Claire and Leon meet each other at a brand new location, or that there are some small character motivation changes, because nobody picks up Resident Evil 2 for the story. People play it for an adrenaline-fueled survival horror experience. Capcom introduced any changes to best serve that goal, keeping you on the edge of your seat. But in Final Fantasy VII, story is king. It's what kept many people at the table in the first place. So again, I ask, why would you change it? It wasn't a case of, wow, FF7 was such a groundbreaking game, but man, the story blew. And it's not some bland RPG that could do with a plot facelift. It's the RPG that escaped out of our basements and into the mainstream. People who never played RPGs played Final Fantasy VII and were mesmerised by the story. Don't even kick that hornet's nest unless you're sure you can improve on it. But listen, I get that if you like the direction Remake has taken, you probably can't empathise with why we're so upset. I guess we're on a totally different wavelength. Imagine you're a famous painter and the Louvre has asked you to remake the Mona Lisa. They're concerned that the painting is deteriorating rapidly. The museum wants to ensure people will fully appreciate Da Vinci's detail and vision, and that new generations will love it in the way previous generations did. So you set to work bringing the painting to life. But you don't stop there. You make a couple of changes. Maybe add a building in the background. Maybe add a man on a bike onto that bridge. They're small changes, things to get people talking, that's all. Maybe you put a UFO in the background, a nod to Mona Lisa's extraterrestrial origins. It's not like the integrity of the painting has been compromised. She's still the Mona Lisa, but it's given you something new to think about, to discuss, to debate. You haven't ruined it, you've added to it by subverting expectations. And besides, the museum asked you to remake the painting, right? Not remaster it. So they probably should have expected a few changes. A one-to-one remake means there would be nothing to look forward to. You're essentially saying that the thing people were going nuts to get their hands on for all those years, they actually didn't really want. If you're saying that Square Enix couldn't provide a one-to-one remake for technical reasons, then that's another issue. Leaving aside that the game is only set in Midgar, and I get there are technology limitation issues that come into play, and yeah, I still feel a bunch of the game's padding should have been removed in favour of at least exploring some of the world map in Part 1. Yes, leaving all that aside, fans argue that Square Enix cannot possibly give you a one-to-one remake because the game would have fallen flat on its face, and that many fans would have abandoned ship after Part 1, bogged down by predictability and a sense of, I've seen all this before. To that I say, look at how much people enjoyed seeing scenes from the original game recreated in new technology. Nobody is complaining about content that was faithfully or near faithfully recreated. Fans of old and new are united on that. It's only the strange changes that have become sources of contention. I felt something stir in my soul when I saw moments evolve from the pre-rendered snapshots of my youth into a fully realised cinematic take. And even after how many times I've played the original game, I devoured those faithful scenes with eager eyes. There was never a moment where I felt bored for witnessing a similar scene to the original game. In fact, often the expanded dialogue or actions brought a smile to my face, lifting a scene to new heights. Fans say with a 1-to-1 remake, there would have been nothing to look forward to, but that's not true. We were all on board long ago, eager to undertake the same journey again. Just like when we go to the movies to see cinematic re-releases of classics we watched in our youth, reliving the adventure on the big screen. Most of the time we have the same films on our shelves back at home, but when we're passionate about something, we're looking for new ways to experience that first sense of amazement all over again. Whether that's by proxy, enjoying it through someone else's eyes for the first time, or experiencing it in a new medium. And just like the audiences who devour Disney remakes, I know a 1-to-1 Final Fantasy VII Remake would have worked, because reliving some of those moments from the original game ignited my nostalgia, returning me to my days sat on the bedroom floor, wide-eyed in front of the TV. And that's the selling point for so many fans, being teleported back to that moment when they first undertook that epic journey. And that's, unfortunately, where Square Enix dropped the ball. Just play the original game, purist. The problem there is Square Enix came looking for us. Their marketing campaign cast the widest net it possibly could, hoping to draw back those mainstream and or casual gamers, or those fans who loved Final Fantasy in the 90s but drifted away. They came looking for us. I keep my eyes on gaming news, but it's illuminating to hear from people who are just casual gamers. They were shocked to learn that the story only went as far as escaping Midgar. They couldn't make sense of the inclusion of Zack at the end of the game. They wanted to know where the world map was, or why they couldn't play as Red 13. These were their beloved memories of the original game, but Remake didn't realise those memories. And here's where I think Remake fans shoot themselves in the foot. A lack of empathy for the original casual gamers who loved Final Fantasy VII, who don't pay attention to gaming news every day, who have grown up into their 30s and 40s, have families of their own, who can't spend every day investigating the ins and outs of a video game before its release. They finish work for the weekend and buy a game, and there it is, in all its glory, clear and precise naming, Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS4. What does that mean to them? What does that mean to the average casual gamer? Hell, what does it mean to even Final Fantasy fans? Oh, but wait, turn over the cover. Come on. Square Enix knew what they were doing, and fans are being unfair to defend Square Enix for some frankly unethical and shameful advertising, exploiting a generation who loved Squaresoft's Final Fantasy VII. You don't have to work in advertising to understand how misleading that is. But now you're telling me those fans can't voice their criticism? They pay the same amount of money as you did. They're consumers of a product, just like you. Because they're such a fan of the original game, they were invested in Remake. How can they possibly just turn away now and ignore it, after all the years of hype and promise? Now you expect to dismiss those people with, go play the original? Nobody picked up Remake hoping to hate it. By trying to bottle up fans' criticisms of the game, you're creating pressure points, which leads to intense reactions. Square Enix's priority should have been the original fans, the ones who lifted FF7 into the stratosphere. Their focus should never have been on compilation mayhem and satisfying character shippers. And by the way, the game's sure not focused on new fans either. I've seen countless people comment that Remake was their first FF game and they don't understand the ending, what it's supposed to mean. They don't have a sense of what the FF7 world is. The game has caused confusion, and it's not even because the game ends in Midgar, it's because Square Enix have favoured convolution. They've chosen, in their never-ending hubris, to focus on their contribution to the FF7 universe, the compilation and all its backers, shunning Squaresoft, shunning Sakaguchi, shunning the fans who made them. But never mind about the new gamers. Throw a couple Ultimanias and 600 YouTube theory videos at them, and they'll be fully up to speed in no time. What about us OG gamers? Play the original game. Yes, the original game is always there, but try hyping yourself up for something for 5 years and then scrubbing it from your memory entirely. Just wait and see what happens. You're judging a game on part 1 of a multi-part series. People who say this are underestimating just how much the original game has already been seriously undermined. Remake is structured as one story, It has a beginning, middle and end. Act 1. Cloud joins a rebel group to blow some Shinra reactors, but during one of the operations Cloud falls to his doom. Act 2. Cloud crashes into Aerith's life. They go on a journey to reunite Cloud with his comrades. He returns to base just in time to see everything turn to ruin. Aerith is kidnapped by Shinra. Act 3. Cloud launches a daring rescue on Shinra HQ. He saves Aerith from Shinra's clutches and they escape from Midgar. Oh, and they face up with Destiny itself. Unlike the opening 4 to 5 hours of the original game, which made up the Midgar section, Remake's story includes complete character arcs, in particular Cloud, who starts in one place mentally and ends in another. In that context, Square Enix gave us a full story, a story that has a conclusion, so that even if they never made a sequel, you have an ending of sorts. Cloud even conquers his fear of Sephiroth by squashing him like a level 7 grunt. The heroes are free from the shackles of destiny, free to write their own future, whatever that means. Cloud went from sullen loner to a leader. Aerith went from someone caught under Shinra's shadow to free from the grip, free from Midgar. The roof has come off. Not a particularly groundbreaking story when judged on part 1 alone, but a full story nonetheless. Yes, this is the first entry in a series with a roadmap of sorts in mind, so it lays the foundations of what's to come. But Square Enix are fully intending us to judge this cinematic tale as its own thing. And to that end, we are perfectly within our rights to judge it as such. But naturally, just as when The Phantom Menace landed back in '99, fans asked others to withhold their opinion until the trilogy had been completed. How did that work out? But talking about the whole wait and see what happens, things have already gone off the deep end quite a bit. But fans act like Square Enix will suddenly spurn those radical elements in part 2. Well, that would be quite the storytelling oddity. Supernatural elements in the first part of a series don't just suddenly fall by the wayside later on. If we're going by the rules of basic storytelling and structure, timelines, whispers, etc. must come into play later on. In response to criticism of Zack's return, Wedge and Biggs alive, and all the NPCs surviving the play collapse, a monumental moment in sacrificing the original game, probably Jesse alive too, fans can only say, wait and see what happens. Except the tone of the game is more than evident now, saving characters to please fans, just to get a scream of joy on a Twitch stream. Yet Square Enix acknowledge FF7 is about loss, while on the other hand alluding to a world where fan wishes can be played out, perhaps offering loss in one world and paradise in another. That's not pathos, that's not tragedy, that's just a cop-out. But the story hasn't changed, and they're not going to change much going forward. We don't know where the story will go, and it's particularly hard to predict things based on Japanese storytelling, which often doesn't follow typical Western formulas for structure and pacing. Yes, I can only theorise, just like Remake fans do, but it's clear to me that the very foundations of FF7 have been uprooted. Look across the internet, people are only talking about timelines, parallel worlds, multiverses, saving Aerith, killing Tifa instead. What happened to the themes of FF7, corporation versus the planet, the fragility of life, and making the most of the time we have, dealing with loss? These themes take a backseat in favour of convolution. Much like Kingdom Hearts 3, Square Enix seem hellbent on shattering storytelling's #1 rule: less is more. You say the story hasn't changed, but as soon as you bring timeline bending and meta awareness into a universe, you've opened Pandora's box. Introduce these concepts into Final Fantasy 15 and you've got a very different story on your hands. If the ability to prevent someone's death is a thing, don't you agree things are suddenly blown wide open in that story? People might say, well, what about Final Fantasy 8 that used time travel for God's sake? Well, in Final Fantasy 8, time travel is hardwired into the story, fed in small doses throughout, and then exploding in its final act. Whatever issues people have with that game, time travel is part of the story, and the game lives and dies by the rules of time travel, acknowledging inevitability and the endless time loop, and the fragility of life. And most importantly, people can't be saved by using time travel. Those important rules are the only way that story works and keeps an honest contract with you, the viewer. By introducing backdoors and alternate timelines to Final Fantasy VII and allowing the salvation of characters we've previously seen blown away, Square Enix have planted a seed in your mind that anything goes, anyone can survive, and that's a dangerous idea to have. Multiverses and backdoors are fine for comic books where heroes never stay dead for long, but Final Fantasy VII was always edgier than that. It's why many of us gravitated towards it. But here's the real problem. Even if everything plays out exactly like the original game from this point on, it's still a defeat. The story would not make sense to suddenly ignore all those elements introduced in part 1. It's counter to what you'd expect me to say, but Square Enix must continue on the new road they've created. In order to create at least a semi-coherent story, they must dedicate themselves to telling this new sequel tale, infused by plot ghosts, alternate timelines, destiny, and predetermined paths. Anything else further cements part 1 as a bizarre exercise in storytelling. As a fan of storytelling, I don't want to see all the beats of the original game anymore. That ship has sailed. When the dust settles, and the Final Fantasy VII sequel series is complete, the plot at least needs to have had a structure, an overarching method to the madness. And Square Enix cannot achieve that now by sticking to the bones of the original game. In my eyes, to tell a coherent story, they are locked into further dramatic changes. In my FF documentary, before Remake came out, I joked about the things Square Enix might change. That they'd make Reno not drop the plate on the slums because he's a fan favourite, that the edginess would be removed from Midgar. I feared they'd shoehorn in every compilation character into the narrative somehow, but I had no idea the level Square Enix would seek to interfere and undermine the tapestry and themes of the original game. The game needed spicing up. Everyone knows who Sephiroth is and how Aerith dies. I've already talked about how I believe that recreating scenes in modern graphics would have had the same impact for both old and new fans. Sometimes, as consumers, it's just that simple. We want what we want. But it seems like Square Enix have deeply overthought the love and respect people still hold for the original game. For example, they seem hung up on Sephiroth's reputation. Kitase said that Sephiroth was inspired by Jaws. That film went for the less is more approach and built the tension using the viewer's apprehension and imagination. Kitase goes on to lament that Final Fantasy VII could no longer get away with that tactic because everyone already knows Sephiroth too well. So his answer to that is shoving Sephiroth into as many scenes as possible and letting you give him the trashing of a lifetime, completely peeling away any sense of fear or tension around him. Too many people know who Sephiroth is. My translation of that is, we don't know how to make Sephiroth scary anymore. Christ guys, you're writers. I'm sure you can think of a way. The entire world knows who Darth Vader is. For 40 years he's been printed, posted, dissected, memed to hell and back. But it didn't stop Disney adding a Vader scene to Rogue One, which has become recognised as one of the scariest appearances of the famous villain. Square Enix could have easily followed the Sephiroth beats of the original game and come up with innovative ways to amp up the fear, but instead they've given us something that completely misses the mark. How do you make a villain scary? By actions, not by words. Not by appearing over Cloud's shoulder to whisper in his ear or rattle off vague monologues. They tried to give him more power to corrupt time, to make him seem more of a threat, but instead if they'd kept him hidden, it would have built suspense for both old and new fans. We'd all be sitting here wondering, what is Sephiroth going to be like when he does eventually show up? What would I have done differently? Remove all the Sephiroth scenes from Remake. I would have expanded on the idea of Sephiroth killing Cloud's mom. Have a scene where Cloud is remembering her murder. Maybe we don't see Sephiroth clearly as he kills her, just a sword, obscured by fire and smoke. Cloud wakes, terrified, a nightmare memory. Don't show Sephiroth, just hear his name. Make the Shinra building an absolute gauntlet to get through, but Sephiroth gets through it with ease, killing the president, and we still don't see him, and Cloud is terrified again when he sees the sword. This mercenary who's been beating enemy after enemy, and yet here he is, petrified over seeing this weapon. And seeing Cloud terrified, now we're terrified too. Sephiroth killing Parrot, although surprising, has zero effect on making Sephiroth a frightening entity. His action is undone seconds later. The villain is being undermined in the first part of a series. Remember the original game, freed from jail, the blood trail, the dead president, everything you had to battle through to get here, completely swept aside by a supernatural force. How do Square Enix make Sephiroth scary in part 2? Well, according to Kitase's comments, I don't think they're trying to. Honestly, it would make more sense to me now if Sephiroth is no longer the villain of the story, supplanted by some new evil. Or perhaps there's an alternate timeline Sephiroth who has become chaotic and sadistic enough to even frighten the Sephiroth we know. So we have to team up with our Sephiroth, Zack, Loki, and all the Spider-Men. Okay, maybe not the last bit. Fans parrot Gantas' everyone knows who Sephiroth is comment to justify against an exact remake. But actually, what Square Enix have done with Remake is completely compound the problem to unimaginable levels. Sephiroth is about as common as a fire hydrant on every street corner. Okay, but what about Aeris' death, fans say? Everyone expects the death scene, destroying the effect. Well yes, everyone knows it's coming, but it doesn't have to take anything away. Everyone knew the Titanic was going to sink when they went to see the film, but it's how it affects the characters that matters. Slight changes are all that are needed, if anything. Or it's enough to just see the emotion on our favourite characters' cinematic faces. Hell, forget the Titanic. You also bought Final Fantasy VII Remake because you were expecting to see the original game recreated, so you already know why fans would appreciate the same things happening again, because that was exactly what you paid the cash for too. Except once you realised Square Enix had flipped the script, you went ahead and flipped your script too. But truly, it's not the fans that are the problem here. Square Enix can talk about fan expectations all they want, but I think the issue is with them. And this is the only part where I have some measure of sympathy for the creators. It's very hard to motivate yourself to retread old ground, particularly if you're coming onto a project or taking the helm of something you had some involvement with prior. Everyone wants to put their own creative spin on something, and getting out of bed each morning to retell the same story you told 20 years ago doesn't get the creative juices flowing, unless you're convinced you can elevate it to some new heights because you can identify clear issues with the original version. I don't think Kazushika Nojima saw enough that he could do with the original script. He had to take it in a new direction, not because of fan expectations, but to satisfy his own creative drive, to give himself purpose beyond painting by numbers. And landing on the Whisper's idea, whether it was Nojima, Nomura or someone else, was probably the spark that set his creative heart going, the idea that gave him a drive and passion that he was creating something new and bold, something that would be discussed and debated across the FF fandom. I get that 100%, but hey, remaking the original game was the job. If you couldn't do it, if you couldn't motivate yourself to recreate the original game, don't do the remake. Ah, but remake is what they did, you say, and a mighty fine effort they made of it, you may add. After all, Nojima is the lead writer of Remake and writer of the original game. The same original FF7 team worked on Remake. Some of the team members involved with Remake helped create a brilliant game released in 1997, but I'll let you in on a little secret. Calling it the same team after Sakaguchi's absence is like Michael Jordan retiring from the Chicago Bulls, but we still call it the same team. When conceptualizing the original game, Sakaguchi highlighted life as a central theme. And if a story is to explore life, it must explore death, or loss. It's no doubt that Gantas, Nomura and Nojima each contributed seismic ideas which shaped the video game we love. There is no denying that. But there are special creative minds that need to be reined in. The original Star Wars script was wildly different. Hell, George Lucas's original cut of Star Wars was wildly different. But due to a combination of restricted financial resources, creative solutions, streamlining in favour of convolution, editing wizardry, and some damn good people in the business, Star Wars became what it was. I hesitate to call it an accidental success, but if you read about the trajectory the original script and cut were on as part of Lucas's original vision, that movie could have turned out vastly different than the sharp exercise in filmmaking and storytelling it is. And the point is, sometimes people need other people around them to rein in their ideas. Sakaguchi was that guy for so many of his staff. With the absence of Sakaguchi, Nojima's writing has gone from poignant to kinda ridiculous. Nomura, an interesting character designer and an ideas man, has proven unable to filter his own work, throwing as much as he can at a canvas in the hopes that something will stick. And Final Fantasy VII Remake reeks of convolution in the name of filling white space. Masses of supporting characters are usually a good indicator of flimsy storytelling, as writers will often subconsciously create extra characters to detract from other hollow characters, or to conceal their own inability to adequately layer those characters. And so we end up with characters like Leslie, the uninteresting Don Corneo bodyguard who adds zero weight to the story, but is as much of an intrusion as the Whispers. I'm sure a lot of FF7's mainstream success was down to happy accidents, caused by technological restrictions, impacting creative choices which worked in favour of the game, curbing more outlandish ideas. But the driving force for thematic consistency and weight was the father of Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi. Never mind that as soon as Sakaguchi was out the door, that Square Enix shattered Sakaguchi's theme of no sequels, they've also shattered the theming of one of the greatest games in the series. If a game is about life, it's also about death or loss. That's how storytelling works, the yin and the yang. And Square Enix can say all they want that they still care about loss, but the truth, as ever, is revealed by actions, not by words. Katase has already hammered home how important it is to keep subverting players' expectations. Surprise is the new dominant currency in storytelling. Surprise gets heads talking, gets social media buzzing, gets numbers moving. But surprise for the sake of surprise is a storytelling pitfall, and it sticks out like a sore thumb when it's not executed correctly, or is a painfully obvious attempt at drawing breath from streamers. Katase should know better. But without that guiding force of Sakaguchi, the other original team members have shown the extent of their imaginations, for better or for worse. Opening the door to a universe where death can be undone, whether it's in one timeline or the next, it's been achieved. Death can be undone, avoided. Even if the entire cast falls off the face of Gaia, in another timeline off screen, they're living their happy ever after. That's the one door that never should have been opened for Final Fantasy VII. And I get that there are fans that are not hung up on the mechanics of storytelling and don't seem to get that funny feeling in their brain when a script goes off the rails. They're living FF7 as an experience, a conveyor belt of donuts straight down the gullet. They don't care about structure, as long as they get the flavour they ordered. I get that, and I accept if you feel that way, you'll probably never get why this is a problem for fans like me. And it's not because we're pessimists, or we just want to see a character die for the heck of it to pay homage to a 20-year-old emotion. It's because we care. We care about storytelling principles and structure, the sanctity of the themes that Grandmaster Sakaguchi crafted. But Square Enix always intended for the story to go this way. Right, Square Enix had this all planned out. That's the common argument. They just didn't have the technology back then. Technology to do what exactly? Show some flying whispers and some big ass monsters? Show an alternate timeline using the same assets? One thing you can be sure of, at Final Fantasy HQ, with Sakaguchi at the helm and his strict no sequels policy, Square had zero plans for what happens next in the story. Perhaps other than some vague scribblings Najima had made on a notebook, as any writer does when they're conceptualizing a world and lost in their own creative thoughts. Nobody went away from FF7 thinking, damn, this is heading towards something more. The story was done, a statement had been made, and we understood we were bound by Final Fantasy's golden and unspoken rule that every game is its own story, never to be revisited. The only thing some people weren't sure about was whether or not the characters had survived the ending. Yes, that was a thing back then. No way in hell were Advent Children, Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus or Remake part of some original roadmap. They were written up as and when Square Enix needed cash. If Squaresoft had different technology in 97, sure, some things in the original game would have turned out differently, but it wouldn't have gone the way compilation took us. We'd be somewhere else entirely. Why? Because it's all made up as it goes along. And I get that writers have key ideas in their head that they want to work towards if the opportunity presents itself. George Lucas imagined the volcanic clash between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and the prequels were the road to that destination, but the beats that take us there are made up as he goes along, or revolutionised or reimagined countless times along the way. That's the writing process. And Najima may have had scenes or concepts he wanted to explore further if given the chance, but almost all of anything, particularly in a professional creative environment, is a melting pot of many voices, how you feel in the moment, and, most importantly, responding to fan desires. George Lucas adds Boba Fett to the prequels, not because it makes storytelling sense, but because it hits the right notes with fans. If the majority of fans played Crisis Core and found Zack boring, you can bet your ass there is no alternate timeline angle included in Remake. If Dirge of Cerberus actually became an all-time classic hit, we get a sequel to Dirge of Cerberus instead, and maybe Weiss is a main character in Remake. So we're in this strange situation where by committing to remaking the original game, the only way Square Enix feel they can grant certain fans' desires is to introduce alternate timelines. That's not planning, that's reactive, and usually stories dictated by reaction create the most storytelling sins. Most people liked Remake. It certainly has huge support out across social media and YouTube, but is that representative of all Final Fantasy fans? Remake fans are equally devouring reviews, analysis and theory videos, while, by and large, content that is critical of Remake has lower support, lots of dislikes and comments filled with anger. Remake fans seem far more vocal and prevalent on social media. So where does that leave me? You think I want to be a Remake hater as a YouTube content creator? It's bad for business. It's bad for my channel in terms of stats and growth. There's a constant desire for positive reinforcement of Remake, not for people to complain about it. In my Good, the Bad and the Ugly Remake review, analytics show most people tune out just as it gets to the bad. And I get that. If I was ultra passionate about something, I guess I wouldn't want to hear people critiquing it. Well, maybe there was a time when I felt that way, when I was younger. It was kind of painful to see people pointing holes in things I enjoyed. It strips away a bit of the magic, I get it. But now I can actually watch critiques of things I enjoy and it doesn't detract from my enjoyment of that thing, because I'm comfortable knowing that I can enjoy something without having to justify it against others' opinions. Yet I've had comments by people accusing me of trying to destroy their fun, as if every critique is a personal attack on them, and that seems odd to me that I have to justify me even having an opinion. It's the old, if you can't say anything nice, say nothing at all, except we're talking about a product we've dropped cash on here. Tell that to all the consumer reviews on Trustpilot. How dare you write a critique about this product that I'm enjoying? Now every time I use it I have to think of your review. But here's the thing, we both know there are many fans out there who didn't like Remake. It's why Remake fans are constantly on edge, ready to snap. If there weren't so many people dissatisfied with the game, then there wouldn't be such intense reactions from Remake fans, and a place for videos such as this. Yeah, I'm a tiny voice in an ocean, but there are many fans out there deeply unhappy with the game. And hey, as far as toxic fans go, there are bad apples on this side too. I see them on social media, resorting to name calling because they can't understand how people could like this game. I don't want any part of that kind of thing, because it's obvious to me why you enjoy Remake. It doesn't take a great stretch of my imagination to put myself in your shoes. Heck, I sometimes wish I was in your shoes, because the next few years will be so much more fun if I was just an outright fan of everything Square Enix was doing. But I have no interest in bullshitting you or myself. You just didn't understand the game. Apparently we don't understand the game, and that's why we didn't enjoy it. Yet, after completing the game, Remake fans rushed to theory videos to try understand the ending. They huddled around social media quoting Max Dude's videos and other theories as gospel, seemingly understanding the game by proxy instead of coming to their own conclusions. Fans confessed to not getting it until they had listened to a YouTuber's breakdown of the plot. Yet even still to this day, Remake fans are split over whether the game has alternate timelines or whether Zack is stuck in the livestream or Zack's scenes are merely a fleeting flashback to the timeline of the original game, that the scenes are just there to confuse. But now that the Ultimania translations are released, fans are flocking to the alternate timeline angle again, bolstered by YouTubers now affirming those quotes, something which I thought the game made obvious. You've turned to your lore experts to try understand how the story works, whereas we didn't need a theory video to see what was clear as day. Even now, fans are arguing over whether the game is a sequel or just a remake of the original game. For what it's worth, while the game is set in the domain of the original, it references future events from the original game that have not yet come to pass, thereby making the game a storytelling sequel. Plus, you can't on one hand say that the Whispers are the original fans trying to stop changes to the story, and then on the other hand say that the game is not a sequel, as the mere inclusion of the Whispers means that the original timeline is something that is canon within the storytelling structure. It's using the original game as a springboard. But what does that matter anyway? No amount of information in future parts will convince people who believe it's a reboot rather than a sequel. Unless Square Enix confirm in an Ultimania, but yes, what does it matter? Well, it only goes to illuminate the utter confusion in the fanbase. How can you say we're the ones who don't understand the game? when fans are in constant battle with one another to try and make sense of basic truths. So, by the way, just because I didn't like the game doesn't mean I didn't understand it. I know and understand as much as you. But going back to that job you did for the museum, remaking the Mona Lisa, the original painting was deteriorating, in danger of fading away. But the original Final Fantasy VII was never in danger of disappearing. It would always be there. So I guess some would say Square Enix had free reign to twist and shape Remake whatever way they pleased, safe in the knowledge the original was bulletproof. Within the next 10 years, odds are Hollywood will start a complete redo of the Harry Potter movies. But if they go wildly off original spec and include a time-travelling Voldemort who is seeking to undo the original Warner Brothers movies, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I can almost see the point of trying something radical because the original movies are so enshrined in popular culture that a close remake would seem redundant. But the difference there is, no one is asking for those movies to be remade. The only reason would be the studio wanting a new license to print money. Whereas a large percentage of the FF7 fanbase wanted the game remade purely to re-experience it with updated graphics. It comes back to demand, and demand creates expectations. Look, I found Final Fantasy VII over 20 years ago. I didn't even know what a Final Fantasy was and why there were 7 parts, and how come I had never heard of parts 1 to 6. When I bought the game, I fell in love with it, despite its warts, and yes, there are warts. It remains my favourite game because nothing has ever topped that immense feeling of wonder and scale. So as you can see, I carry with me a heavy dose of nostalgia. Naturally, remaking the greatest game of all time would prove a tall task for fans like me. I already choose to consider Advent Children, Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus as non-canon, willfully ignoring everything after the original game. So adding Remake to that list probably won't take much mental work from me. I'll consign them all to a fanfiction folder in my mind. But that doesn't mean I can't vent, that we can't explain our frustrations, because we were a part of this story from the beginning. So if you disagree with our opinions, that's okay, but trying to water down our arguments in the name of blindly defending the game and company's honour is never a good look. Rather, acknowledge our points, shrug your shoulders and go about enjoying the game, or instead, explain why we're wrong and why Remake story makes storytelling sense. But don't tell us to play the original game or parrot hollow claims that are easily refuted. That only continues an endless cycle. I understand why you love Remake. It's easy to see. But can you understand why we're disappointed?